Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you all, excellencies, representatives of the African Union Commission, colleagues, brothers and sisters from wherever you are joining us in the world. My name is Shuvai Nyoni, as Ambassador Salah Hamad has said, and I'm the director of the African Leadership Center in Nairobi, Kenya. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the first panel of this fourth edition of the Transitional Justice Forum. We'll be looking, as we have been told already, at the state of transitional justice in Africa, but particularly examining the state of transitional justice alongside the AU's theme of the year on silencing the guns, as well as considering the impact of COVID-19. And this particular panel is assessing the African Union's transitional justice's policy framework, its role and contribution to silencing the guns and creating conducive conditions for Africa's development. This forum and conversations about the state of transitional justice and the project to silence the guns in 2020 or by 2020, as we've heard from many of those who gave us opening remarks, is being held against the background of an Africa that can be described as bleeding. And I might add, haunted by ghosts from its violent past. Over this past weekend, we were horrified to learn of the brutal killings of at least 12 school children in Kumba, Cameroon. For the last 2 weeks or so, much of the world has been held mesmerized as #EndSARS protests have taken Nigeria by storm. And while investigations take place, we can conclude that scores have been killed as the state has interacted with protesters. In Guinea-Conakry, violence and unrest has followed President Alpha Conde's third-term electoral victory. Tensions persist in Côte d'Ivoire ahead of the election. Some weeks ago, we witnessed a military coup in Mali following weeks of citizens' protests. Moving from West Africa, Director Matlosa has already referred to the Cabo Delgado province where extremist elements continue to operate in the area. In Zimbabwe, activists have protested against arbitrary detentions of political and human rights activists and state and structural violence against women and students. Protests and campaigns against violence against women in South Africa and Namibia are central to daily hashtags and online campaigns. And of course, ongoing violence meted out, especially on the bodies of women and girls, continues in South Sudan. As Africans, we have breathed collective sighs of relief as our countries have for now escaped the worst imagined health and mortality impact of COVID-19. Unfortunately, we cannot say the same about the social and economic infrastructure of countries across the continent. And here already the chair of the CSVR board has referred to this. Lockdowns and movement restrictions have affected the livelihood of activities of many families, and states continue to grapple with the large-scale economic fallout. So 2020, the year of silencing the guns, can be characterized by conflicts and crisis, as we've already heard, the loss of life as a result of these conflicts and crises, with significant impact on the physical and bodily integrity of women and girls, as well as men and boys. The increased action and demands by African citizens for better living conditions and a desire to live long and live well. It can also be characterized by increased leadership by young people, and here again, Commissioner Solomon Dersso referred to this. And young people across the continent are increasingly calling and speaking truth to power and placing a demand on governing leadership for accountability. Also, the intensified conversation and exchange amongst citizens in online spaces and on the streets, outlining the kinds of futures they want. The situations I've touched on were described by Director Matlosa as human security, political, human rights, and economic crises. And these are all intimately intertwined with the long historical grievances and unresolved tensions that transitional justice aims to address, but with serious implications for future peace across the continent and how we not only achieve it, but also the process of moving towards it. So today, Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, I have with me a stellar cast to help us unpack some of these issues, and those laid out by our eminent panel who opened this forum. Joining me today, we have Dr. Solomon Ayele Dersso. We've already heard from him. He is the chairperson and commissioner of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We also have Mr. John Ikubaje, senior political officer in the Department of Political Affairs at the African Union Commission. We have Ms. Patience Masua. She is the Namibia Country Director of Southern Africa Youth Forum, SAYOF. And we also have Dr. Aleu Garang, Head of Mission for South Sudan and the Director of the Mediation Support Unit for the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, IGAD. I will give a little bit of more information about these four panelists as we proceed before they speak, but I just want to share with you how our session this afternoon will run. It will be an interactive session, and we look forward to participants posing questions.
من المفيد أيضا أن نقول أنها ستكون حصة تفاعلية ونطلب
Our panelists will make introductory remarks and then respond to a few opening questions, which I will pose. We will then open the floor for participants to raise questions. Please make sure to raise your hand using the icon, the relevant icon on your screen, but also feel free to pose your questions and make comments and remarks using the chat box. After that, we will have some closing remarks from panelists. Please do note we have interpretation, as Ambassador Hamad mentioned earlier. We have interpretation in all of the AU official languages. To use the interpretation so that you're hearing the correct language, make sure you click on the language you want to hear in and to mute the original audio so that you can hear the interpretation. If the interpreters, please feel free to let us know as speakers if we are speaking too fast. I will also request my panelists to put their videos on if they're able to when they're responding to questions. So as I mentioned, we will start today by hearing from Dr. Solomon Dersso, the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Dr. Dersso is a non-faculty professor at the School of Law and Governance Studies at Addis Ababa University and is the founder and managing director of Amani Africa Media and Research Services, which is a policy, research and consulting think tank recently established in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Dr. Dersso is a recognized expert on the African peace and security architecture, particularly AU's Peace and Security Council. Dr. Dersso's diverse research interests and subject matter expertise include international human rights, constitutionalism and democratic governance, peace and security in Africa, international criminal law, and transitional justice. It is a pleasure to welcome you today, Dr. Dersso. And in the response to the first question, please, Dr. Dersso, if you could describe or talk about your particular engagement with the African Union Transitional Justice Policy in your work, how this engagement intersects with the AU's theme of the year, to silence the guns by 2020. So over to you, Dr. Dersso. You're most welcome. Do we have Commissioner Dersso with us? Sophia?
Hi, Shuvai. I don't see him.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see him either.
Yeah, let me send him a message. It could be a connection issue.
Okay, that's quite fine. We could move to John, to Mr. John Ikubaje. John, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, please, John, if you could please respond to the first question. Just let us know a bit about your particular engagement with the AUTJP in your work. I know you are a central figure to the development of this policy, and let us know how in your work it intersects with the AU's theme of the year, to silence the guns by 2020. Over to you, John. You have 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Shuvai. Let me start by saying that I currently coordinate the African Union Transitional Justice Program at the Department of Political Affairs of the African Union Commission. And a lot of work is being done with regards to operationalizing the policy. One is there are a lot of things that we have done with regards to operationalizing the policy. One is undertaking, responsible for the leadership in time of guidance with regards to the operationalization of the policy. One of the things that I have done with the supervision and leadership of the commissioner, the director, and also the head of the division is a development of what we call a roadmap of implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And this roadmap clearly indicates what needs to be done for effective implementation of the policies. And so we are in line implementing some of these issues. And like, for example, what we are currently doing is part of the roadmap plan on operationalization of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. I have also been supporting one of the goals of our program on transitional justice, and which is one of the areas that the African Union Transitional Justice Policy emphasizes, which is knowledge generation in support of implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Recently, I co-authored a paper with Professor Maklusha on transitional justice in the Horns of Africa, lessons for the Gambia, from the Gambia. And what we try to do is to do a comparative analysis on implementation of transitional justice on the continent, particularly drawing from the Gambia experience to influence positively the transitional justice implementation in countries like South Sudan and also in Sudan. I have also been providing technical assistance to the African Transitional Justice Legacy Fund. That is one of the private funds that has been established on the continent to support the work of the civil society organization on implementation of transitional justice in West Africa. In addition to that, I'm also currently leading a process at the African Union.
أفريقيا.
Sorry, I also said I'm also currently leading a process at the African Union on the establishment of what we call the African Youth for Transitional Justice program. Like if you listen to some of the intervention that has come in, particularly by Dr. Solomon Dersso, talk about the need to cater and also address the needs of the youth with regard to addressing conflict on the continent. So we believe that the need to participate also in the implementation of transitional justice on the continent to legitimize both the process and outcome of transitional justice. In addition to that, we also intend to organize, to establish what we call the African Women for Transitional Justice in Africa. And what we are also planning to do with this regard is to ensure that the African women also participate actively with regards to implementation of transitional justice to legitimize both the process and also the outcome. So in a nutshell, this is what I have begun at a personal level at the Department of Political Affairs of the African Union Commission. But having said that, I think it is important to indicate with regards to the work that we are currently doing at the African Union on the transitional justice, that the African Union Transitional Justice Policy has three broad issues that it aims to address. The number one is the legacies of armed and violent conflict. Two is the human rights violation and bad governance, or what one might refer to as governance deficits. And the third one is underdevelopment challenges, including the COVID-19 that has posed so many challenges to our development in recent time. If these three challenges that are the core drivers of armed conflicts and underdevelopment are successfully dealt with as envisaged in the African Transitional Justice Policy, guns will not only be silenced on the continent, there will automatically be a conducive environment for socio-economic transformation. Because of time, Shuvai, I will not be able to talk on other issues, but there are three important arguments that I want to make. The first one is to contend that the African Union Transitional Justice Policy has entrenched capability to silence the gun if the provisions are strictly adhered to and implemented according to by member states and also other partners. And this including the principles entrenched in the transitional justice policy. And secondly, is that the policy has inherent provisions that will promote conducive conditions for African socio-economic transformation. And this will also be hinged on one condition, and that one condition is effective implementation of the policy by member states. Because of my time, the third point that I want to make is that In addition to that, there are practical impacts on what the African Union Transitional Justice Policy has accomplished. In addition to the draft policy, I'm saying draft policy because as you are aware, having worked in CSVR, you know that the draft policy, the draft African Union Transitional Justice Policy has been in place for almost 9 years before the adoption of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. So in addition with the policy and also the draft policy, a lot has been accomplished by the African Union. One is the role of the African Union Transitional Justice Intervention in Kenya, the electoral crisis in 2007, the mediation role that the AU played under the peace process helped Kenya peace and development process. You can see more on with regard to what the AU has achieved in the work of Godfrey M. Musila that talk about the roles of the African Union in transitional justice process in Kenya. In addition to that, the AU Commission of Inquiry on South Sudan and its impact on Chapter 5 of the Revitalized Agreement of South Sudan is also contributing significantly to the ongoing peace process and development in South Sudan. So these are some of the practical achievements that the African Union is making or has made with regard to its work on transitional justice on the continent. Thirdly, is the influence of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy on Gambia peace processes, particularly on the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission. If you look at the work that it has been done, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy has influenced significantly what the Commission is currently doing, and this is helping to silence, not only to silence the gun, but also to ensure that there is a conducive environment for socio-economic transformation in time of development in the country. Also, although the AU was not directly involved in the peace process in Mali, the ECOWAS intervention, however, in Mali was a direct play out of the African Union Transitional Justice provisions in paragraph 123 to 125 of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. So dealing with the roles of the regional and regional economic community in conflict situation, there are divisions of labor, and the African Union work in close collaboration with REC to ensure that there is peace in Mali. Finally, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy also has significant impact on silencing the guns and is currently creating a conducive environment for socio-economic transformation to the extent that regional economic communities and member states are now using the African Union Transitional Justice Policy to develop their own policy and programs. For example, ECOWAS is currently developing its own transitional justice policy and is using the African Union Transitional Justice Policy to do that. It's also developing an access program to justice using the same African Union Transitional Justice Policy. We have IGAD, who is currently developing its regional reconciliation policy using also the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. So in a nutshell, because of time, this is how the African Union Transitional Justice Policy and programs are contributing to silencing the guns and creating a conducive environment for development on the continent. Sorry for taking time because of the time.
Thank you very much, John. I think you have given us quite a solid overview of the role of especially the Department of Political Affairs in not only the development, but also the operationalization of the transitional justice policy. You've also given us some examples of where some strides have been made. I still sense a tension, however, John. At the very beginning, all of our opening panelists talked at length about the various situations across the continent that face us, where silencing the guns is just not taking place. You yourself have you've referred to COVID-19 and its impact. And you've also referred to Mali, which I will come back to a little bit later. But John, I just want to take you back to two things you said about in relation to silencing the guns, which are around essentially political will and then effective implementation. John, I'd like you to assist us, because we have many people on this who are part of this forum, who participate in this forum, who may not necessarily be part of policy institutions. and do not have, may not have as you know, an understanding, a similar understanding to your own about how our policy institutions work. So we hear terms like political will, effective implementation in relation to policy frameworks, policies such as the AUTJP, bandied about often. But can you tell us what will it really take? Or how can we see, what is the evidence that you know, the AUTJP is indeed contributing to silencing the guns? We heard many examples of how the guns have not been silent, especially in this year 2020. John, can you give us just a little bit more before I turn it over to the next person? Thank you. Just 1 minute, John.
Yeah. Now, with regards to political will, the essence, or another words or terms for political will, has to do with political commitment. As some of you that are familiar with the provisions of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, you will see that this is one of the most comprehensive policy globally with regards to the issues of transitional justice policy. But as you know, a policy is a mere paper. It's a mere paper. And it is only the commitment in time of operationalization, in time of adherence, you know, commitments to implementing the provisions of this policy that can bring about the transformation, the justice, the essence of transitional justice that we are talking about. And this is the reason why it is very important that member states, regional economic communities, and all the stakeholders, including the civil society, are committed to the provisions. If not, we can have a very good comprehensive policy like this. But if the commitment is not there on the part of the different stakeholders, particularly the member states, we may not see the intents, the outcome that is expected of the transitional justice. Like, for example, if you look at the work that we are currently doing in member states, a very good example is the work that is being done by the Gambia. If you look at the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, and you look at the commitment with regards to how the way they have adhered, utilizing the African Transitional Justice provision to support the work of the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, you will see that we are beginning to make impacts in that country with regards to result on issues of transitional justice. We have also seen some other countries, which I will not necessarily mention in, where we have not seen that commitment, you know, in embracing their transitional justice program, utilizing the African Union provisions in the policies. And so we see in some countries where we are making serious progress with regard to their transitional justice program because of their adherence to the provision and commitment to the implementations, you know, using the provisions in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And in some countries that are currently implementing the transitional justice mechanism, because of lack of adherence and total commitment, you know, to the provisions therein in the policy, we seem not to be making the type of progress that we were expecting to see with regards to implementation of the transitional justice program. So these are some of the challenges that we are currently having, but we are beginning to see that regional economic communities and also private donors organizations are also coming up with technical support to some of these our member states, and we are beginning to see some changing in terms of strategy and approach with regards to commitment to implementation of transitional justice. But the point I'm trying to make here is that commitments is very critical. It is one thing to have a policy in place, but if there is no commitment, we will just be talking about policy in place. But it is only when there is commitment to implementation. And when we say commitment, we mean putting in place the necessary resources, both technical and financial resources, ensuring that all the principles of the transitional justice policies, principles of inclusivity, principle of national ownership, are all adhered to and implemented accordingly. It is only when we have this type of implementations of all these principles, when implementing the pillars of transitional justice policy as indicated in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, that we can have an effective transitional justice program that will silence the gun and also create a conducive environment for socio-economic transformation on the continent.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I think, the more you speak, the more questions that are coming up, as well as for not only for myself, but also our participants. And we will come back to you a bit later, but already we are hearing some questions around commitment. What will this commitment look like when we see it? If it were to walk in a room, what would this commitment look like? There are two questions already so far for you. One says, we see that the AU is making significant strides in the Gambia, in Sudan, etc. But what role is it playing in promoting transitional justice processes in Zimbabwe? Another question is referring to Guinea today, that yes, we are talking about transitional justice. This is the 4th forum, but today as we speak, young people on the streets of Guinea are being assassinated by the defense and security forces, and the AU does not seem to be reacting. So John, two things for you to ponder as we move to the next person. This idea of commitment, what will it look like? What does it look like? The second question around the immediacy of implementing or operationalizing this TJ policy in relation to immediate violations of rights of citizens. But John, thank you very much, and we will come back to you. And for everyone participating in this panel, my apologies, because I moved to John so quickly, I was not able to introduce him properly. John Ikubaje is a senior political officer in the Department of Political Affairs at the African Union Commission. He's a fellow of the United Nations Regional Human Rights System. He holds a master's in political science from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and also in governance and development from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. He is, as we have heard, responsible and oversees human rights and transitional justice within the Democracy, Governance, Human Rights and Elections Division of the DPA. Excuse me. And now we will move over to Patience Masua, sorry. Is Patience with us, Sophia?
I'm just checking.
Is Dr. Garang with us as well?
Dr. Garang is here.
Okay, so perhaps as we check for Patience, we can move to Dr. Aleu Garang. As I mentioned, Dr. Aleu Garang is the IGAD Head of Mission to South Sudan, is the Director of the Mediation Support Unit of IGAD. He holds a PhD in International Law and an MA in Peace and Security Studies in Law and Sharia Islamic Law. Dr. Garang is a legal practitioner, a peace and conflict practitioner, as well as an author in history, law, and anthropology. Dr. Garang, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on this panel today, and we're very much looking forward to what you have to share with us. The first question that we have been looking at is if you can just tell us a little bit more about your particular engagement with this AU transitional justice policy in your work, in some of your day-to-day work. Our colleague John has talked about how the DPA is using and interacting the policy amongst regional economic communities and amongst some of the mechanisms across the continent. So how does your engagement with this TJ policy also intersect with the objective of the African Union to silence the guns by the year 2020? Dr. Garang, I give you 3 minutes for these introductory remarks, and we'll come back with further questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for listening in. On this strategic approach by the African Union developing the TJ, Transition Justice Framework, and in light of the current theme of this year, we have worked as IGAD to assist our member states to work on silencing the guns. We have quite a number of conflicts. So far, Sudan, South Sudan, we have existing conflict also within Somalia. Not to say that there are other no conflicts, but these are the hotspots that we have been working on as IGAD within the region. So on the Somalia process, there was a process by Djibouti, even though there are no guns that are active in the Somaliland conflict, but there is an effort to also move from a negative peace where there is no fighting, but there is no peace at the same time, on how to restore the Somali state back to normalcy and address the outstanding situation where we have currently de facto two states, even though IGAD regions only recognizes the state of Somalia. So there had been efforts by President Gele, I believe, from Djibouti in the first quarter of this year. They culminated those efforts by a signed understanding of communique by the two parties on the way to continue the engagement towards finding a solution to that situation. On the South Sudan conflict, we have the implementation of the agreement mediated by IGAD, and two countries from IGAD region took lead into this agreement seeing lights. That's Uganda and Sudan. Even though it was an IGAD process, the process is still in the implementation phase. We have passed the element of mediation to an element of peace implementation, yet IGAD retains its own special envoy to follow up on that. We have another subsidiary process that relates to this, done jointly by IGAD and the State of Vatican. There is an NGO called San Gideon that is working on this process in Rome. And the idea is to engage the non-signatories to the Revitalized Peace Agreement of 2018 to make sure that they are also part of the process and we silence the gun. That's on South Sudan. On Sudan, we know there are a number of conflicts in Darfur, Blue Nile, Nuba Mountains, Eastern Sudan, in addition to the transition that the government of Sudan had underwent or is still undergoing, given the new changes in the system by the uprising, bringing on board a new agreement between the military and a group of Sudanese professionals who are able now to form a government that is running the affairs in Sudan. So there is a mediation by the Republic of Sudan, of South Sudan, on the conflicts in South Sudan, in the conflict in Sudan, where we have number of parties signed, around 13 movements and political actors have signed a peace agreement between them and the government of the Republic of Sudan. Yet there are two major groups that are holding out. They agree almost on everything that had been signed, but they needed more specific and more elaborated in a text in order to achieve a total silencing of the gun when it comes to this. Now, all these are the efforts that leads to the transitional justice elements or frameworks where we talk of reconciliation and we talk of ending the reoccurrence of violence. But those are the major active conflict that we are working on as IGAD in supporting our member states. On our side as IGAD Secretariat also, we have developed a transitional justice framework that was due to be shared and validated, and is still going to be validated within the coming 1 or 2 months. We will also share it widely for comments. So this is in a nutshell what we are doing on question 1.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garang. So just to follow up on what you have shared with us, which is really very illuminating, how do you see this work that IGAD is doing on silencing the guns, and it is quite a lot of work, there are quite a lot of efforts across the region from what you have shared. How does this intersect with a continental TJ policy, as well as your own sub-regional or regional one that you said is yet to be validated?
We believe that as much as we stand as IGAD member states looking at issues within our frameworks, we also believe that these things are being developed in line or in coordination with the African Union framework. For example, the major emphasis in our work is always dialogue. Even though most of these activities that are undertaken by member states are taken unilaterally as member states, not collectively as member states, they still also follow the same principles of dialogue, mediation, and prevention for further escalations. However, it's our duty to take this as IGAD Secretariat to the next level, where we take it within each member states with emphasis on reconciliation, where national dialogue is needed, where there is a debate that should be seeing lights on matters related to reconciliation and how we forgive the past, how we as citizens of our region and even specific citizens of each member states where there is a specific conflict, look at how we address and remedy these past practices, whether through acknowledgement, truth and reconciliation frameworks, strengthening national institutions that are working on these matters, as well working with civil society groups, youth groups, women's groups, because we want more ownership and we want sustainability. It's not just a decorative activity that follows a peace agreement and a political implementation, and the next in line is reconciliation audit and maybe a report, and that's it. We want the society to own up, and all those steps are being set clearly in the African Union TJ.
Thank you. I just, before we move on to the next speaker, I'm a bit curious, or I wonder, in your for you, what would you say are some of the greatest risks to silencing the guns in the region, in the IGAD region, posed by a failure perhaps to adequately address some of the historical grievances or some of these issues of the past that you have referred to?
This is one element that's a reality, that often solutions that are addressing conflict are cosmetics. They look at the usual template, power sharing, wealth sharing, and sometimes we call it responsibility sharing, but they don't address where the problem is. For example, and this is not a self-criticism only, it's a reality on the ground. When the first IGAD mediated peace agreement was launched and conducted, the interest was to have more or less a solution at a certain level, which is a political level. Rather than looking at where the problem is, which was, we know in South Sudan, was in the ruling party. The conflict was a conflict of a ruling party. It's not a conflict of states, not a conflict of tribes or ethnicities or cultures or anything. And eventually it will have to be resolved that way. Now, when we look back at the revitalized peace agreement, we see a peace agreement. We see power sharing, we see a lot of things happening, but still the conflict is not addressed because the conflict was about succession for who is next in line in the ruling party. And now in South Sudan, and this is just an example of many other conflicts that exist, the way it has been addressed is that we have, let's say, 6 versions of the SPLM, and the whole conflict is about who will be next. And you have to be associated with the SPLM, which is the ruling party, Sudan Liberation Movement, in order to gain momentum when it comes to elections, because this is where the liberation legacy is. So often people would find solutions in terms of addressing conflict using existing templates, but rather than going through the actual causes of conflict. And by doing so, we hibernate conflict. We don't address conflict. And it's just a matter of time that it blows up again. We may have agreed that guns are silenced now currently in South Sudan, at least between the signatories. We have one or two movements that are still intransigent because they are not signatory to the peace agreement. But more or less, there is a huge reduction of violence when it comes to that matter. We could say there will be, this is a path for peace. This is a passage that we may arrive at peace agreement being fully implemented. But it will take a little bit of a time, a culture, or efforts in order to arrive at the end game, which is a democratization process. So when we have a democracy, that's when we will have a freedom of expression, freedom of organization, free elections and fair elections, and that will on itself silence the guns. Because this conflict was about accessing power to begin with, and will remain about accessing power till we set the rules and norms to address that power. This cuts across even the mediated conflict by South Sudan now on Sudanese conflicts. We are not seeing that the main issues, which is separation of religion and state, being clearly addressed. And if you would address it in a manner that will just arrive at people celebrating peace, ending conflict, rebuilding states, but the main issue that caused two layers of civilian rights, Muslims and non-Muslims, then you are not addressing the problem. So it needs more debates and more dialogue, and hopefully a reconciliation takes place after people have spoken their minds.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garang. I think what we take away from these opening remarks of yours, at least for me, one is around root causes. So how we can leverage something like a TJ policy to address root causes. And also historical legacies. I want to leave with you as we move on to Patience Masua. I want to leave with you, Dr. Garang, two questions for you to reflect on, and we may come back to these if we have time. The first is, what sorts of processes, so you talked about the need for processes that address root causes, so you've mentioned dialogue and more honest conversation, but what are some of the processes that you can think of that the AU transitional justice policy could surface or leverage to address some of these root causes of conflict in the region? The second one is around historical legacies. Now we've seen and we know that across the IGAD region and other regions of the continent, violence against women, conflict-related sexual violence is part and parcel of conflicts. Some of the guns that are used in conflict in these regions is sexual violence. So what are some of the turning points in addressing some of these issues that something like a TJ policy, whether it's the AU one or an IGAD one, could be used? So I'll just leave those with you, and hopefully you can touch on some of those when we are as you respond to some of the questions from the floor. Now, Sophia, can you confirm for me if Ms. Patience Masua is with us now?
Yes, she's online.
عندها يمكن أن تقدم لنا إجابات عما ذكرنا.
Okay, we will proceed. I think from time to time we have interruption or intersection with the translation, with the interpretation. So I'm hoping that Ms. Patience Masua is with us. Patience, are you with us? Can you just identify yourself and put your video on if you're able to? Okay, if Patience is not here, I will invite our participants, and perhaps we can turn to her once she is able to connect again. But I'll turn to our participants and some of the questions that you are posing. And let me just have a look quickly at some of the questions we have here. So for you, John, I already shared those questions. The one was about Zimbabwe. So what role is the AU playing in promoting TJ processes in Zimbabwe, given the successes and the great strides made in the Gambia and Sudan? There was another question regarding Guinea, that we're talking here today about transitional justice in Africa, but in Guinea, as we speak, young people are being assassinated by defense and security forces. And so what future of the credibility of the Union with regard to young people who demand justice, reconciliation, and lasting peace when the AU is quiet, is silent? So perhaps, John, we can hear from you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shuvai, for those important questions. But let me first start with the issues of political commitment, which you raised the other time. That it is all about, when we talk about political commitment, it's all about political clash, political institution, creating an enabling environment for effective implementation of transitional justice. And when we say creating a conducive environment, we mean practical commitment in terms of ensuring that there are resources with regards to implementation of our transitional justice program. But let me give practical example. If you look at the different transitional justice commission on the continent, you will realize that we always have a good and excellent beginning of transitional justice commissions. But at the end of the day, you realize that majority of their recommendations are not implemented. So on this note, one can indirectly conclude that there is no political commitment. If there is political commitment, then the government of the day will put all the necessary resources, both technical, financial, to ensure the implementation of the outcome of Transitional Justice Commission. So that is just one example. Another example with regard to the political will is the issues that is currently happening in South Sudan, for example, with the establishment of the hybrid court on South Sudan. Well, there are some analysts, some researchers, academia, that believe that currently there is no political will on the part of the South Sudan government on the establishment of the hybrid court on South Sudan, because they have not signed the agreement that needs to be signed, the MOU with the African Union, for the establishment of the hybrid court. But for us at the African Union, we want to believe that the government of South Sudan is still putting its house in order to sign that memorandum of understanding for the operationalization of the hybrid court for South Sudan. If eventually that agreement, that memorandum is not signed, and there is no implementation, operationalization of the hybrid court for South Sudan, then we know that the political will is not there. So in a simple analysis, this is what political will is all about with regard to transitional justice, in my own understanding. Now, with regards to Zimbabwe, I think there is a modus operandi in the way that we operate at the African Union Commission. Hello? Hello?
John, I think you can proceed.
Okay. Now, with regards to support to Zimbabwe.
Sorry, your volume is low again, John.
Okay. Sorry. With regards to support to Zimbabwe, like I said, that the African Union has rules and procedure with regard to the way we work. Usually, we expect member states, to come in, make a request for us to be able to provide technical assistance. And that is exactly what Zimbabwe has done. The Zimbabwe Truth Reconciliation Commission came and requested that the African Union Commission should provide technical assistance for them to understand the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, so that they can use that one to implement their program on transitional justice. And what we did last year was to send a technical expert to the Zimbabwe. And the technical expert made a comprehensive presentation of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, and also recommendation to the government of Zimbabwe, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on how they can practically implement their transitional justice program. And so this, can you hear me? Okay. And so this is what we did with Zimbabwe, and we do hope that in the nearest future we will be able to provide technical assistance to the government of Zimbabwe, like in the areas of training, in the areas of forensic investigation. Those are the type of technical assistance that we provided to the government of other governments. So we hope that we'll be able to provide similar assistance to the government of Zimbabwe. In addition to that, briefly on Guinea, let me say that currently, the Commissioner for Political Affairs, together with the senior officials, political officials from the United Nations and ECOWAS, they are currently in Guinea working on post-election mediation. The essence of all this is to ensure that the gun is silenced and to ensure that the conflict does not, aggravate to another level that we will regret tomorrow. And so we are currently working with other stakeholders, particularly the international communities and also the ECOWAS, to ensure that there is peace in Guinea. In addition to that, there were also some silence mediation and peace mediation that were involved, that the African Union, together with other RECs and other key stakeholders, played prior to the election. But some of these things were not made known publicly for people to see. But the African Union has been up and doing, engaging the process in Guinea to ensure that there is peace prior, during, and also the post-election period. Although some of these things can be challenging, but one thing is that the African Union, together with the ECOWAS and others, they are currently implementing one of the first pillar, which is the peace processes in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And that is the reason why the Commissioner is currently not participating with us.
أو خلال مرحلة ما بعد الانتخابات والاتحاد الأفريقي من أجل الركيزة وهو ما يقوم به المفوض في الوقت الراهن.
Thank you, John. If I could request the technical team to please assist us with the interpretation, because we keep hearing the sound from the interpretation and it's we're hearing it over the speakers, over the panelists. So please assist us with the technicalities of the interpretation so that everyone can hear the panelists. Thank you so much, John. Were you, had you concluded, or there was?
Yes, that's what I was trying to conclude, saying that the representative of the African Union, the Commissioner for Political Affairs, that is the reason why she is not attending this meeting. She is currently in Guinea to ensure that, on a mediation mission together with the ECOWAS and the United Nations officials. So effort is ongoing and we are working tirelessly to ensure that there is peace in Guinea.
Thank you so much for that, John. And the participant who put the question is Ababa Barry. Ababa Barry, if you have a follow-up, please do feel free to put it in the chat to that response on the AU's response to the ongoing challenges in Guinea at the moment. Before I come back to Dr. Garang, I'd like to move to Ms. Patience Masua, who I believe is now online with us, she is one of the panelists joining us today. Patience is the Namibian country director of the Southern Africa Youth Forum, SAYOF, as I mentioned earlier. She's the former Secretary General of the Namibia National Students Organization. Before this, she served as the Speaker of Parliament for the University of Namibia, and she is a Young African Leadership Initiative, YALI, alumnus, and widely published on issues of social justice, gender-based violence, and youth empowerment. She's also a volunteer and national spokesperson for the Change One's Life Namibia, which is a non-profit organization focused on feeding, clothing, and educating the vulnerable communities in society. And also Patience is a holder of an LLB degree from the University of Namibia. I just want to remind us that this is the first panel for the forum. It will be slightly longer than other panels, although we will aim not to keep you here all afternoon, but also just to remind us that today we are trying to set some of the founding lines of the conversations that will follow over the next couple of days. So please bear with us, but also please to ask your questions, pose your questions in the chat, raise your hands if you want to ask your question to the panelists directly. Patience, you are very, very welcome today, and apologies for some of the technical challenges you had in joining. If I could ask you to respond to our first question today, which relates to your particular engagement through your work with the African Union Transitional Justice Policy but also how this engagement intersects with the AU's objective to silence the guns by 2020. So Patience, over to you. If you're able to switch on your camera, that will also be very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Welcome.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me. I think I'd like to start with a quote at the launch of the theme Silencing the Guns. Comrade Biens Governors, who's the under SG of the UN, said that silencing the guns happens strategically in two ways. The first way is obviously the physical dropping of guns. And the second way is the broad development of our people in order for the silencing of the guns to happen subsequent of that development. And so there's a broader goal of peace and security, which hinges on conflict prevention, early warning of conflicts, crisis management, post-conflict reconstruction, reconstruction after conflict, after circumstances such as COVID-19, for example, which obviously brought about many other issues that also relate to these guns, defense and security and development. But the main questions that we need to ask before we dive into the discussion is really, where are the guns and what are these guns? So we're looking at conflict, we're looking at instability, and the consequences of those guns are often related to the roots of those guns. So what are the roots of those guns? Poverty, inequality, the lack of access to basic healthcare, the lack of opportunities, unemployment. All of those are factors that contribute to these guns, but these are also factors that come about as consequences of these guns. So the real question is, how do we prevent these guns? And then secondarily, how do we silence them to prevent that cycle from repeating itself? I think one of the root causes in my area of work in particular is the fact that we still have at least 600 million unemployed youth in Africa. And what are the secondary results of that? It manifests in crime. It manifests in drug abuse. It manifests in alcoholism, and it manifests, unfortunately, in all of these different guns that affect our continent and that affect the processes of transitional justice. And we can't have proper implementation of transitional justice unless we have active development to take away those factors that hinder the type of development that we want with transitional justice. So what do we need to do? We must address the economic and social causes through multi-sectoral programs that address these challenges. So we're looking at member states, we're looking at civil society, we're looking at private sector, we're looking at NGOs, people that are on the ground that have direct access to those who are victims of these guns. Unfortunately, the reality, Comrade Moderator, is that the guns often affect the most marginalized people of our communities. It affects the most marginalized and the most excluded groups. We're talking about women, we're talking about children, we're talking about youth, and we're talking about the people that suffer mostly from effects such as poverty, from effects such as inequality. And we've seen considerable progress, I suppose, in gun hotspots such as your Angolas, your Sierra Leones, your Cote d'Ivoires, your Liberias.
تقدما في إدارة بعض
that we now have an upsurge. I think we have a sound issue.
غينيا والكوت ديفوار
Interruption of the interpretation.
I think
هنالك
it's
تقطع في الترجمة. نعم، يصلنا الصوت
silent now.
متقطعا إلى
Nonetheless,
مقصورة.
so we've seen that
Yes.
unfortunately for us, COVID-19 has completely disrupted transitional justice processes. COVID-19 has completely hindered any sort of progress that transitional justice would have liked to have achieved. I'll use Namibia as a case study. We have had and we're a population of 2.5 million people, over 3,000 cases of rape, murder, femicide in Namibia from the beginning of COVID-19 up until now. For the last 8 days, every single day, we have had a case of rape or murder of a child or a woman in Namibia. We have had protests last week and the week before that, where youth have been calling for the Minister of Gender to resign, where youth have been calling for a state of emergency to be declared because of femicide, because of rape, because of murders of our women and our children disproportionately by men in our country. So we are saying that COVID-19 has effectively bred an environment in which the harsh reality of inequality, the harsh reality of rape, and everything that goes against the principles of transitional justice can thrive. And that is an unfortunate state of affairs, but that is a reminder that our efforts in promoting transitional justice, those efforts need to be preventative instead of responsive. We need to start looking at efforts to promote a growth and a development of our continent that is not responsive based, but that is proactive. So that is my general observation in terms of how far we've come in terms of transitional justice and how far we still need to go. Unfortunately, I do think that we've gone backwards in terms of where we're supposed to be due to COVID-19. But I do think that COVID-19 provided a unique opportunity for us as promoters of transitional justice and as a group of people that want to advance transitional justice, to really look at the extremity that we're in now and how we can prevent this in future. We need to stop being responsive and we need to start being proactive.
Thank you very much, Patience, and thank you for also highlighting the kind of adding more to this conversation around root causes that I think Dr. Garang earlier pointed us to, but also some of the outcomes and the impact and the state, especially of young people, the situation they find themselves in across the continent. I'm going to move to Dr. Garang now, Patience, but before I do that, I want to pose some questions to you that you could think through before we come back to you. The one is, you suggested multi-sectoral programs that address the economic or the socio-economic causes or underpinnings of much of what causes, as you said, the guns to not be silent. Do you have examples or contexts where you've seen some of these kinds of multi-sectoral programs? What do they look like? What would they do? And how would they simultaneously achieve the goal of silencing the guns, but also addressing historical grievances? You've referred to the GBV cases that you said have been happening, 3,000 women and girls, children being raped, etc., in this COVID period. How would some of these multi-sectoral programs address some of the underlying root causes, but historical causes of some of this violence or the non-silent guns that we see in society, even, for example, Namibian society? So when we come back to you, if you could please touch on that. Allow me to go back to Dr. Garang to respond to some of the questions that I had posed. There are also other questions to you in the chat, Dr. Garang, that maybe we can come to after you've
All right, thank you very much. Regarding the two questions you asked about the processes to address these violent occurrences, and as I mentioned earlier, that these processes should focus more beyond the templates, like the textbooks that we have for mediation, that it should focus on these issues and those specific solutions, but rather should be case specific, depending on the nature of conflict, depending on the area, depending on the actors themselves. So we have to be able to alter the textbooks to actually come to address whatever we find in the conflict analysis. That's number one. But that said, I think there are standard areas that we need to look at. And this is not a suggestion of a template anyway, but rather than encouraging certain processes. One of those processes is dialogue, and dialogue necessarily should not be taken into the context of an organized national dialogue rather than dialogue itself as a process. So dialogue among the politicians and dialogue among communities and dialogue among communities and authorities. And the idea of dialogue itself is under-narrated because we often don't use it to the full extent. We often use dialogue on the political level. But dialogue itself, even on the political level, should not be geared towards arriving at solutions, but rather than those solutions, the focus should be understanding one another. Once we understand one another, it will be easier to actually work on finding solutions between one another. So that's a process that I believe TJ should work on. It addresses current conflict, it at least creates an understanding on those conflicts and find solutions. It helps finding solutions when we find a way to address one another. The second thing is most processes are also not deep into addressing people's needs. So if it's a conflict, people die, it's only the politicians who get to benefit. If it's mediation, they want to mediate at the track one level, and that's it. But we have to bring it down a little bit to people engagement. We need people to people orientations, processes where people are heard and their grievances are also recognized. And maybe that's all they want, that sense of recognition. And maybe it would be a passage to common understanding. The third process is accountability. We often write good texts and we write these types of hybrid courts, but how often do they work? Do we remember anybody tried by the African Union's hybrid court with the Sudan's agreement on Darfur? Often no. Nothing happens on that. We have another hybrid court in South Sudan now. I'm not sure whether this is the major priority between the political elites now implementing the revitalized peace agreement, even though it's chapter 5 of the agreement. But often people read chapter 1 and 2 and they forget about the rest. Chapter 1 and 2 is responsibility sharing. Possibly if it gets to be implemented, it goes to chapter 2, which is security arrangements, but that's it. Often people don't see that accountability matters. And this brings me to the issue of the fourth process, which talks of reforms. How do we reform society? We often reform institutions. We talk of reforms, and it's about political appointments here and there, and making sure that the institutions are overhauled in general in order to rebuild them. But that does not lead to reform. It just brings in new people, maybe new corrupt people, because they will not come via merits. They will come to power also using these what is called in Sudan, muhassasat, which is giving shares. So everybody gets a share of their own represent.
أناس
So the last one that
حصتهم من قال.
When we talk of reforms, we need to talk of how do we change society? How do we bring in a new narrative where society is changed from being violent oriented or violent responsive to conflict preventive? And that brings in the element of peace building and peace education. So this is an ongoing process of on its own, and I believe, as the previous speaker spoke, it's at the heart of the TJ process itself. You have to have a peace education in order to arrive at preventive measures rather than responsive measures. On the second question that you raised about the historical legacies, and you highlighted as a moderator the question of sexual violence, and often is very difficult to deal with those matters that relates to social violences, but also it comes down to the same way we address preventive measures to address reoccurrences. We need more education, we need peace building, we need peace education, not only in schools, but also on general terms, where we need to hear about it in the radio, in the songs, in the newspapers, in schools, in the syllabus, and then over time, we may create another generation that does not think in those terms. For those who have committed such heinous acts, they need to be accounted. They need to be brought to books. And often, yes, a crime is committed by individuals at the low level, soldiers. Still, they need to be held accountable. We often go for the big generals and the commander-in-chiefs, which is necessary, but still, those who commit those acts need to feel that they have done something wrong. I'm sure no commander-in-chief will order soldiers to go and rape a group of women. It would be something they would think of their own, but because of lack of accountability, they would think this is necessary to continue subduing the others, whether culturally or this sense of pride that they have achieved something. And it still needs to be accounted for, and everybody in the chain of command also needed to be accounted for, because if somebody says, I've done nothing, I did not commit this crime, you would ask, what have you done to make sure that those who have committed such crimes were brought to books? Definitely, when you do an exercise of an audit, you will find nothing was done. Possibly it was more of an encouraging environment rather than an accounting environment. Apart from those, also we need to look at the victims, not always the victors. The victims need and deserve psychological support. I'm an advocate of reparations. People need to be compensated. It's the duty of the state to make sure that every citizen is protected. So when the state fails to protect, and when state actors or soldiers from the national army or national police or national security or whatsoever manage to break the law and break people's rights, then and violate those rights, then the same state is bound to compensate. So once that happens, now they would know that the more you compensate, the lesser money you would have for other things. The more easier now to ensure that people are online following things as per their TORs, and that they are accountable, even if it's not the policy, but there is accountability that comes with it. Still, the government would have the right to protect, and if it fails to protect, it will have the right to pay reparations. Those are the questions that were raised. On question 2, which talked about the specific applications of this TJ on the IGAD region, or what we do. I would say we encourage dialogue. whether it's national dialogues or communal dialogues, and we work closely on prevention. And in order to do that, we also have to follow the three-layer approach that we have, which is encouraging and strengthening and fostering women inclusion, youth inclusion, and strengthening national institutions. National institutions, because that's the duty. This is what the governments are there for. They're supposed to render services, they're supposed to prevent conflict, they're supposed to have the efficiency to predict conflicts and sort out those conflicts before they happen. So we encourage building those capacities. We have several offices that work on those areas. We have security sector program in IGAD, ISSP. We have C1, which is the early warning unit. We have our counter-violent extremism on those matters. We have other specialized offices also that focus on specific countries. Nonetheless, often you have the national capacity there, but the space to allow inclusion where you have youth, women representation, not to the standards that helped also by the reluctantness of youth groups and women groups. They may be there, there are too many, but either the concept of gatekeeping, where you don't want others to be part of the process, or is the low networking abilities. And this is why we train, we build capacities, we help these networks, and we encourage advocacy as well with governments. More emphasis are needed, and those more emphasis are needed on issues of mediation. And mediation does not have to be always track one. Being intergovernmental organization, we always do track one. But we need also to go beyond track one, to track two, track three. Also more emphasis are needed on political will. Member states talk, they are very good at talking and signing normative documents. But when it comes to adopting those documents, they drag their feet, their political challenges inside. We understand that, and we still work as IGAD with our member states for our member states to adopt these documents and ratify them and take them further. So this is on question 2. I'll leave it for you.
Thank you, Dr. Garang. There are some more questions for you, which I will just again pose to you, and we can come back to them. There are just 2 of them. The one is from Joseph Akech, who has agreed with some of your analysis regarding conflict resolution and the approaches deployed by IGAD, with the focusing on structural issues, power and wealth, etc., and some of the cosmetic reforms instead of people, as you've already responded to. But he's asking, would it not be fitting, therefore, to say that transitional justice has to be conceived within and outside of the revitalized peace agreement, in South Sudan at least, to allow other methods of transitional justice not currently part of what has been conceptualized by IGAD? And then the second one is, how is IGAD responding to the ensuing conflicts in Ethiopia? Do you think what is happening now in Ethiopia is the lack of dealing with the past after the demise of Mengistu? What do you think the possible scenario and its implication for peace and security for the Horn of Africa? And this question is from Adane Gebremeskel. Thank you, Adane, for your question. So Dr. Garang will come back to you in another round. But let's go over to Patience, who is going to come back to us on the question we posed to her a bit earlier. Over to you, Patience.
Thank you very much. I think when we talk about these multi-sectoral programs, the problem is that I don't think we have worked aggressively enough as government, as NGOs, as civil society organizations, as international organizations. We've not worked aggressively enough to facilitate transitional justice in the sense that it brings about the outcomes that we want to. And that is why we still have a society in Namibia, for example, where 80%, 86% of the land is owned by the bottom 5% of the population. So what are we saying? And I loved how Dr. Garang spoke on land redistribution. Number one, our people don't have land. And, you know, he says that the same government that had allowed for the land dispossession to take place should be the same government that has the power for the land repossession to take place. So aggressive land policies to ensure land redistribution in a way that is in a way that is adequate and in a way that is reflective of the demographics that we have in our country, economically, socially, culturally. That's the first thing. The second thing, affirmative action aggressively. And this is not me being radical, this is me being developmental. Because we have so many students, for example, that are excluded from access to tertiary education simply because their parents are previously disadvantaged and they cannot afford a tertiary education. So we still have major inequalities in education and subsequent access to an economy. And then we're looking at aggressive policies on youth unemployment, aggressive policies on skills development and training for citizens to partake meaningfully in the economy. Because what do you do then? Then you deal with issues of grassroots crime, you deal with issues of living standards that can be improved, you deal with issues such as housing, etc. So those are generally the multi-sectoral programs. So really just putting international organizations to task, putting civil society organizations to task, putting government to task to take a more aggressive approach when it comes to these issues.
Thank you so much, Patience. Thank you for that, and thank you for giving us a bit more practically what can be done. We know that in your experience, you also have evidence of where some of this has worked and how it can be leveraged in order to change some of the situations we've been referring to. When we come back to you, Patience, I would like you to address two things for us. You'll see in the chat, there's been a comment that was made directly in response to your opening remarks regarding trauma healing and responding to trauma as a way of dealing with the root causes of violence. So I just wanted to ask you, in some of the situations you have talked about, even you know, the 600 million unemployed youth across the continent, what is the place in your view of trauma healing, responding to trauma of young Africans in particular, and how could how could we possibly take advantage of this transitional justice policy to engage in some of this trauma healing? Then the second question for you, Patience, is what is different about, you know, in the opening panel, we heard from Dr. Solomon Dersso about the role of young people. So my question to you is, what is different about what young people are asking, doing, and demonstrating about how we can silence the guns going forward? Thank you very much, Patience. Now let's come back to you, John. Again, there are a number of questions for you in the chat. There's a follow-up from Barry regarding Guinea, and the follow-up is that AU's response is late. So what prospects really are there for transitional justice and the success of the AUTJP, not only in Guinea, but in other countries? So again, the question around timeliness or the timing of of operationalizing the AUTJP. Is it only something we can refer to when we record or enumerate some of the successes of the African Union, or is it something that going forward we can actually draw on or relate to? And then there's another question for you, John, that says you hinted about the African Youth for Transitional Justice. Please elaborate more on this and the possible role of the youth in the drive on around transitional justice in Africa. And I will come back to you, John, on these two questions. But before that, I have been informed that Commissioner Solomon Dersso is back online with us. Sophia, is he here?
Yes, he is.
He is. Okay, Solomon, Commissioner Solomon, welcome back. Apologies for the technical glitch that had you disconnecting from us. We've been talking so far, just getting an overview of the different panelists and their engagement with the AU transitional justice policy and how their engagement intersects with the theme, the AU's theme to silence the guns by 2020. But for you, Commissioner, because we heard some opening remarks, I'm going to dive straight into a question for you that I hope you can use as part of your 3-minute kind of introductory remarks to us. In your opening remarks, you referred to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights study on human rights and conflict, and then also a study on transitional justice in Africa. What would you say are some of the key lessons and learnings that can be gleaned from those two studies about how we should do things differently and a different approach going forward, given the kind of year we have had with COVID-19, given many of the ongoing and new conflicts or crises, violent conflicts and crises we are seeing across the continent? Do you see these pieces of work offering something for the next decade where we will still carry the objective to silence the guns? There is also a question from Andrew Songa in the chat, which I will pose to you, Commissioner Solomon, to respond to. And Andrew Songa's question is, since silencing the guns remains an ongoing concern, can we anticipate a successor to the 2016-2020 AU Master Roadmap on practical steps to silence the guns, as a pathway to enhancing this political will and accountability that everyone is talking about? Can we envisage perhaps an annual reporting framework to the AUPSC that consolidates the activities undertaken by various AU organs in relation to implementing the AUTJP at country level, while also inviting alternative reports or briefings from civil society? So Commissioner Solomon, over to you. For now, you can respond to the first one if you would prefer to come back to the second one, which is in the chat, so we can hear from you just your introductory or opening remarks. So 3 minutes for you, Commissioner Solomon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shuvai. Apologies for that as well. I once again wish to reiterate my thanks and appreciation to the Department of Political Affairs and CSVR. On your question on the two studies. So the African Commission on Human and People's Rights undertook two studies of direct relevance for the theme of this year's Continental Forum on Transitional Justice. One, as you pointed out, relates to human rights in conflict situations. This is the study of the Commission that was commissioned on the basis of Resolution 332 of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. This study concerned with the question of how do we address and effectively respond to human rights issues and concerns that arise in conflict situations. And the premise behind this study is that conflict and crisis situations constitute the setting where the most serious violations of human rights take place. So if the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is to effectively execute its mandate, it is imperative that it addresses itself to these sites of conflict and crises where the most serious violence or violations of human and people's rights and international humanitarian law happens. Now, the question always is, of course, how do you go about doing or executing such a task for the African Commission on Human and People's Rights? And indeed, it is against the background of this question that the Commission mandated the conduct of this study, which was carried out over the course of 2016 to 2018. And this study specifically focused on identifying existing practices as far as addressing human rights issues in conflict situations is concerned, and the gaps in those existing practices. And then it looked at how these existing practices, which are positive, can be consolidated and the gaps can be filled. And from the review of the work of both the Commission itself and indeed that of the African Union system broadly, the Commission identified around 5 issues that need to be addressed in order to effectively respond to, or in order to put an effective mechanism for responding to human rights issues in conflict situations. So these issues relate to issues such as, for example, the whole question of prevention, issues relating to the whole question of monitoring and reporting and investigation, issues relating to coordination between the human rights organs and the peace and security organs or mechanisms of the African Union, the questions relating to dealing with the expectations and interests of the protection of civilians, broadly speaking, in conflict situations. And then you also have the question of, once violations do happen, how do you go about effecting redress or remedies? So these are the 5 different areas that have been identified, on the basis of which the Commission adopted a 5 pillars approach for an effective system for addressing human rights issues in conflict situations. So the Commission adopted this study, and then on the basis of that, of course, the Commission has started operating. And one of the different ways of doing this is, of course, for the Commission to, for example, submit its observations with respect to human rights issues arising in conflict situations, and indeed advise the African Union policy-making organs relating to peace and security how human rights issues in conflict situations can be addressed. So the Commission, for example, this year submitted its observations in respect of the situation in Libya and the situation in the Sahel in the context of the AU heads of state, the AU Peace and Security Council heads of state meeting that took place in February this year, focusing on these situations. Subsequently, in the context of the annual consultative meeting between the African Commission and the Peace and Security Council, a very robust model or framework for coordination between the two has been outlined under the PSC communique of its 866 session, and then most recently, just this month actually, we had another one which covered, among other things, country-specific situations, some of which not necessarily on the agenda of the Peace and Security Council. Now, we made a very strong case here, saying that respect for human and people's rights, providing the basis for silencing the guns in so many ways. First, when human rights are respected, even in a context of armed conflict, then the possibilities for resolution is much higher than when human rights violations take place, because violations of human rights make the resolution of conflicts more protracted and much more difficult, and hence the need for compliance with human rights standards. And this, we said, need to happen at different levels. There is a role for the African Union system, and indeed there is a role for the parties, particularly states, because they set the example for how the compliance with human rights standards needs to happen. So this is one. The other one is mainstreaming human rights in mediation, conflict prevention, post-conflict reconstruction, conflict resolution, and management processes across the conflict spectrum. We think that that is extremely important, again, not only in limiting the impact of conflict on civilians, but also importantly in having a conflict resolution process that is much more sustainable and that is much more also in concert with addressing the underlying factors which are directly related to human rights once again, whether we see it through the prism of socioeconomic rights or through the prism of bad governance that directly concerns civil and political rights, or through the prism of inequalities and marginalization. These are all interrelated and they speak directly to the standards of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And therefore, the need for that mainstreaming, which is critical. And in all of this, of course, we indicated that as part of the implementation of the conflict spectrum mainstreaming, the importance of always monitoring, investigating, and reporting on these on human rights. And also, ultimately, this takes me to the next study, which is the study on transitional justice. Ultimately, it is about addressing the violations that took place in conflict situations or in situations of repressive authoritarian rule. And this takes me to the second study, which is the study of the Commission on on human and people's rights and transitional justice in Africa. This study is complementary to the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And indeed, these two need to be considered together if you wish to have a full and comprehensive authoritative understanding of AU's statement on transitional justice on the African continent. Now, this study, of course, once again, looks at the question of, among other things, whether and how transitional justice processes can be made to comply with and indeed be informed by human rights standards. And linking it to the first study, in the first study, as I said, among other things, we need to address human rights violations and issues that emerged in conflict situations or in other crisis situations, which may be linked to situations of oppressive rule, depending on the threshold, of course. You have the question of threshold there. Now, let me say a few things on the transitional justice study and how it links to today's theme and the specific question that you asked. What is it that these studies offer, looking into the next years specifically? The first thing is the approach to transitional justice, whether at the level of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights or at the level of the African Union, had until recently been on an ad hoc basis, which means you respond to and apply your advice and your guidance on a case-by-case basis, rather than on the basis of a comprehensive consideration of all the relevant normative standards and indeed applicable instruments. Now, with the transitional justice study, as well as the African Union policy and the conflict study, you can be able to provide a comprehensive guidance having regard to all the relevant considerations, both at the normative, but also at a contextual level. That is the first thing. The second thing is the various principles, standards, benchmarks that are provided both in the Commission study and the African Union Transitional Justice Policy actually offers you a menu of options that you can choose from as relevant for your context. Because one of the things both the African Commission Study and the AU Transitional Justice Policy avoid is, a one-size-fits-all approach for transitional justice. Because transitional justice processes have to be designed to meet the transition and justice demands of the society concerned. And in order to do that, it can't be the case that all countries will choose all the 7 or 8, for example, mechanisms in the transitional justice policy. No, it is possible, for example, as has been done here in Ethiopia, to choose only one mechanism, such as, for example, the Reconciliation Commission, as has been done here. But the most important aspect of all of that is not really the menu of options, but how those options are designed. So 2 things that I wish to say, and I will end with that. Both the study and the AU Transitional Justice Policy provided what I call guidelines on the process dimension of transitional justice, which is as constitutive as the substantive dimension of transitional justice. And the process dimension, by the process dimension, I mean how a society goes about initiating, discussing, and designing a transitional justice process or a transitional justice mechanism. And here I'm talking about a number of rights relating to this process, the process dimension, such as participation, the most important one. Participation in particular of affected members of society whose rights have been violated as a result of conflict or as a result of repressive rule. Their participation and active role in the discourse and indeed in the process of developing either the legislation or the institution or mechanism for the transitional justice process. That is critical. The second aspect is, of course, the content or the substance aspect. And here we need to take into account, of course, a number of considerations. One of them is obviously the whole question of what kind of remedies do you avail to victims, or as I wish to to use a different language, survivors. The second one, and most important, equally important, is of course the accountability dimension. What kind of accountability do you envisage to have? The third relates to, obviously, the various mechanisms that you put in place in order to ensure that the society is indeed on a path to transition, that the transition is not reversed, on a sustainable path to transition, because transition is not seen as a short-term process. If you look closely at the definition of transitional justice in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, it is rather seen as a journey to peace, stability, democratization, and inclusive development. So it is putting the society in a sustainable journey towards these ideals or these objectives. It is about those aspects. So the institutional reform dimension, the policy reform dimension of the content or the substantive dimension of TJ are highlighted there. And I think last but not least, as I have highlighted in my opening remark, is the account that needs to be given to historical injustices, not necessarily in the context of the conflict, but also the injustices that occasioned the conflict themselves. The gender dimension of both the historical injustices, but also the gender dimension of what the conflict itself or the repressive rule itself created. The other one is the intergenerational dimension, which relates to much of the stuff that's happening on the continent at the moment. And this is the use. And again, here we have a multi-dimensional or a multi-dimensional approach to it, not only in terms of participation, but also ultimately in terms of the kind of system. When I say system, I mean governance, socioeconomic, political, and institutional governance system that we put in place in a society, and the kind of not just place, voice, but also active role that is given for the interest, for protecting the interest of youth, but also for them to articulate how that interest can be advanced. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Solomon, and we will come back to you. We are, however, coming very fast towards the close of our time together. So for John, Dr. Garang, and Patience, I will ask each of you to take just 2 minutes in your responses to the other questions that have been posed to you. Solomon, for you, when you come back, I would also like to add just a question on what you see as the greatest risks of achieving what you have laid out for us. So what do you see as the greatest risks over the next 10 years, really, to achieving some of these things that that you have referred to? And then also the question from Andrew on perhaps an additional period for silencing the guns, given that we clearly have not achieved the milestones. But I would like each of you to just give just 2 minutes to respond, so that we'll come back with a final round of closing and wrap up. I do not see any additional questions in the chat. I believe, okay, there's one on the Gambia, which is how far will the AUTJ policy go to addressing the concerns that victims in the Gambia may have around the outcomes of the Truth Commission, which is that perpetrators will not be brought to book. So John, I will add that, I'll tack that onto to your questions. But if I could just have 2 minutes response to these last questions. So John, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Patience, then we'll come to Dr. Garang before rounding off with Commissioner Solomon Dersso. But please just 2 minutes, because we will have one last round of concluding remarks. So John, over to you.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to add, I will cut you off at 2 minutes, colleagues. So please don't force me to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shuvai. I will be very fast so that I'll be able to cover some of the issues that the questions that have been asked. Now, with regards to the fear that the recommendation of the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission may not give justice to the victims, I think it is too early to come to this conclusion, because the work is still ongoing. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the African Union, we have been practically involved in the process. And the rate at which the work is currently going, we are optimistic that the recommendation will be comprehensive and also will do justice. And in case this does not happen, there is also, and I think if you look at the approach, the process has been very participatory. And also, for example, the media and the civil society were granted access to TRRC process in the Gambia. So there is opportunity for the media and also for the civil society to provide and to come up with an alternative report at the end of the TRRC process. And by so doing, we will be able to see areas that were not covered in terms of recommendations, and which the alternative report may as well cover. Now, because of time, the other issues which was raised has to do with the African Youth for Transitional Justice Program. Like I said, this is one of the core activities on the roadmap of implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice Program that we have developed. And the essence, the aim of this is to promote impactful inclusions of the youth in transitional justice process on the continent. And this is not just going to be a piecemeal participation provisions, but there is going to be, so that they will be play critical role. And also there will be training for them, technical assistance for the youth, so that they can actively play their active role. And also in the areas of institutional reform, we will want the youth to also participate, to make recommendations in the institutional reform. So in a nutshell, this is what the African Youth for Transitional Justice Program is going to be all about. And by first quarter of next year, we are going to be starting our call for application for youth across the continent to participate, and we will train the youth and also support them to participate in transitional justice. The same thing is also going to apply for, to the African women for transitional justice program. The same things will also apply. Now, with regards to issues of reporting on implementation of AUTJP, we are currently working on reporting to 2 AU institutions on implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. One is the PRC Subcommittee on Human Rights, Democracy, and Governance. By November this year, we will be reporting on implementation of the Transitional Justice Policy. And later on, we will also narrow it down on implementation of member states' transitional justice program. So it is gradual. The first one that we are currently doing is going to be on implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy in November. Later on, we are going to be following on report on specific member state implementation of their transitional justice. Finally, with regards to Guinea, I think, well, one might say AU intervention is too late, but I want to say that it is better late than never. And what we are currently doing is in the right thing that we're supposed to do. And if you look at the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, the provisions and also the reports that Commissioner Solomon talked about, the provisions of these two policy documents, they are forward-looking. So it is never late. And what we can do, what we will potentially do, is to use these two policies to engage the process in Guinea, so that we will be able to come up with positive recommendations that will influence their transitional justice program at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sophia has indicated that Dr. Aleu Garang has dropped off because of his connection. So patience, we will come to you, please. You have 2 minutes. Do we still have
lost her as well?
We've lost patience as well? Okay. So let's come back to you, Commissioner Dersso, please.
Thank you for those questions. I think as far as the additional period for silencing the guns is concerned, I think I don't think that the fact that this year was meant to be the year for silencing the guns is indicative of the need for having this project on account of the fact that we have indeed a long way before we achieve that ideal. Remember that silencing the guns is one of the flagship projects of Agenda 2063, and Agenda 2063 is being implemented from 2013. So even in terms of the timelines, if you think about it, I think many agree that the timeline for 2020 was ambitious, but the most important thing is that there is a concerted effort towards achieving or coming closer to achieving an ideal like that one. And the question has been, what kind of mobilization do you do? But if you think about the 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, this will be running from 2013 to 2023. So, for example, one of the things that happens, including with respect to, for example, the amnesty months, which was running from 2017 to 2020, it would be extended so that it coincides with the 10-year implementation plan, which runs until 2023. So I would imagine that the same thing would happen as far as silencing the guns, if concerned. I think, of course, the most important question really is, rather than thinking broadly, about this agenda, it may be better to ask the question, how do we apply, or what does silencing the gun means in a specific context, such as in Sudan, in South Sudan, in the Sahel, in Mali, Burkina Faso, Libya? What does it mean? and what are we doing in those specific cases. I think that is the kind of approach that needs to inform moving forward the implementation of this agenda. Coming to the second question in terms of risks, obviously there are a number of risks. First, I think it's important to put this up front. Whether it is human rights or the transitional justice policy of the African Union, I think by their very nature, they are state-centric. When I say state-centric, what I mean by that is that they depend on and require the active role.
هذه نفحص هذه
technical team, if you could assist. Please proceed, Commissioner Dersso.
Yeah, they are premised on the active role and responsibility of state actors. So one of obviously the most obvious risk is the extent to which state actors are willing and able to implement and indeed make good use of the richness of the materials availed through these policy and legal instruments. So that's the most obvious one. The other one obviously also relates to a question of implementation. You know, it has become a cliche to say that the African Union is good in articulating normative instruments, but when it comes to implementation, there is always a trouble or a problem. This speaks to the first point, but it also speaks to the whole question of whether or not the AU has the means and the infrastructure to either encourage, or if you like, to have the carrot that creates the appetite for states to implement, or the stick, if you like, that enforces implementation of these instruments. I think that obviously is another issue that we have to look at. The other, and not necessarily too separate from the previous one, is a slow pace of diffusion of norms. I don't know how many people, for example, now know on the African continent if the African Union has a transitional justice policy. I'm not talking about just ordinary people, but even academic institutions, universities, even media, civil society organizations. I really don't know how many of these are there. And the pace of diffusion would be another factor, I think. Another factor that I consider is intervening factors. I think there are a number of intervening factors, unfortunately, that are beyond the control of African states, such as, for example, COVID-19, the pandemic. It's a major intervening factor that can have very devastating consequences, both for peace, but also transitional justice processes, slowing down, even reversing development gains that have been made, democratization gains that have been achieved, for decades. Structural conditions are the other risk factors. I think one last point.
Yes.
The implementation of these things, I think it is a reiteration, depends on the engagement of various stakeholders. It doesn't depend not necessarily on the AU only or states only. I think it requires a bottom-up engagement as well, which means academics, media, civil society organizations and their role become so critical, either to take advantage of these instruments or in terms of avoiding the risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Commissioner Solomon. I think, as I asked John earlier, I mean, I think these are very, you've laid out these risks very well. And I think, how do we take it to the next level? How do we then begin to address some of these risks, but in a very practical, practical way? So thank you very much for that. So for dear participants, I think we have come towards the end of our time together this afternoon. Thank you so much to those of you who are still on the line. It has been a very long session this afternoon, but I'm assured that the remainder of the forum will have much shorter sessions. Thank you for your attention. I will pose one last question to our two remaining panelists. And if, Sophia, please do indicate if Dr. Garang or patients have managed to come back online. The very last question is how each of you in your own personal capacity intend to contribute to the objectives of both the transitional justice policy, but also the objective to silence the guns. And we've heard that it will clearly not be by this year, by 2020. But what is your personal commitment? Everyone has spoken about youth, about young people, about future people, and the intergenerational aspect. In your own personal contribution, how will you engage young people, future people, the next generation on these issues? So John and Commissioner Solomon, if you could respond to that as you close your remarks for this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shuvai. I think for me at the personal level is to make sure that this program on youth for transitional justice in Africa is operationalized, and to make sure that we look for resources from different corners, and also to train and to capacitate our youth so that they will be able to participate effectively in transitional justice processes on the continent. In addition to that, is also knowledge generation is very critical in the areas of experience sharing. We already have the report of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on the situation of transitional justice and human rights in Africa. We need more documentation on transitional justice in Africa. So I intend to also work more in this area, particularly sharing the African Union's Commission's experience with regards to African Union transitional justice policy, so that member states and other stakeholders can learn from that and also support effective implementation of transitional justice on the continent. Finally, I think I will also be working with regards to also, liaising with relevant institutions in support of transitional justice implementation. As you may be aware, there is now an establishment of what we know as the African Transitional Justice Legacy Fund, which is providing technical support to civil society organizations' engagement on transitional justice in West Africa. I am personally working and advocating for the African Union Transitional Justice Legacy Fund to expand its areas of intervention beyond West Africa, so that we can also begin to benefit the good work from the good work that they are currently doing in West Africa, in other sub-regions, in other regions on the continent. So in a nutshell, personally, this is what I will be working on, what I have been working on, and I will continue to work along that line, so that at the end of the day, we see effective implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice in member state implementing transitional justice mechanism on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And I do hope that as you realize, the 70 odd people on this platform today will hold you to account to these promises. But I also hope that your own personal intentions will extend beyond your role at the African Union as senior political affairs officer. But thank you so very much for this contribution, not only to the work on transitional justice, but also your service to the continent and to the next generation, which you have pledged to do today. So Commissioner Dersso, over to you.
I'm not sure if I should state my personal commitment, because you already put forward the accountability dimension, so it is. Shuvai, thank you so much again. I think just one point, if I may make, that has to do with the imperative for building constituencies for African Union norms and policies among the African public. I think it is both when we have states who are committed to domesticate these norms, and also when we have an African public that is informed and on the basis of that being informed is able to apply and articulate the implementation of these instruments at the national level. So for example, if I may give you one example, in 2014, one of the instruments that was used in Burkina Faso in the campaign against to stop Blaise Compaoré from having a third term was the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which was used by protesters to say no to the third term attempt of Blaise Compaoré. And indeed, the reference to the charter made it to the transitional charter of Burkina Faso as well. This came about because there were members of the public, including the youth, who were informed of and who knew how to deploy these policy and legal instruments for purpose of bettering their conditions and fighting against misgovernance and indeed abuse of third term. Now, in terms of, I think, personal commitment you mentioned, the personal commitment that I have is I continue to maintain my passion for working on these issues, which I consider to be dear for me, but also indeed for the future of our continent. And in this respect, of course, what I consider to be my area of strength is to use positions of influence that I have in order to open doors, but also to advocate for the interest of not necessarily the mainstream and the majority, but the interest of those who are on the periphery, the marginalized and the discriminated against. I think those are the ones that need our support and indeed our solidarity. Knowledge production is extremely key. We have a lot that we have to do in that respect. And of course, it's extremely important to understand that the youth is not one block. The youth is a very diverse group in terms of sex, and therefore the needs of male and female is different. And that different needs and interests need to be taken into account in our engagement with youth. The need of youth in urban areas and in rural areas, it's completely different. The needs of educated youth and those who are less fortunate to have access to school are completely different. So we need to really disaggregate the interests of youth in our approach and engagement of youth so that our engagement with youth is effective and speaks to their lived experiences. Thank you very much once again, Shuvai. Thank you all very much for your kind attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Commissioner Solomon. And I think if we do not see you leading the charge on ensuring that in this work, the needs of youth, of young people are disaggregated, and also if we see you not opening doors for young people, we will certainly be be holding you to account. But thank you very much to John, Commissioner Solomon, our two remaining panelists, but thank you also to Patience, Dr. Garang, whose inputs were really very critical, I think, for this discussion, which has laid out a very good, an excellent path, I think, for the next few days as we continue with the forum. I will just leave you with a couple of words. I have a long summary. I won't give it because we are out of time, but just some terms and words we've heard today that I hope as the forum unfolds, you will delve more into some of these ideas that have been put on the table. We heard very clearly from all our speakers about root causes and the need to address root causes, both in simultaneously pursuing transitional justice across the continent and meeting the objective of silencing the guns. We heard about process. Everybody spoke about process, and I think questions around how do you go about those processes. I think Dr. Garang laid out really interesting things around process, which I will not go into. Questions around sustainability, but also tangibility. And I think the question around Guinea, the questions around Mali, the questions around Zimbabwe, even Namibia spoke to those questions quite succinctly. This notion of an intergenerational dialogue and exchange, which I think Commissioner Solomon has also expanded on quite importantly. Knowledge generation and knowledge production. And then finally, this idea of political will, but keeping in the backs of our minds, what does this really mean? I think all of our panelists have referred to that, whether it's in the examples around South Sudan, the examples that John has given, as well as Commissioner Solomon. But I think more conversation on what do we see when we see political will? What will it be that we are seeing? If we were able to point at it and say there is political will, what will that look like? So thank you so very much, Ambassador Salah. I will hand over to you. And thank you so much to CSVR and to the AUDPA for the opportunity. Thank you so much.